Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever in the world you are. Welcome to this program. Today, I'd like to discuss the issue of good governance. I think we cannot deny that in Zimbabwe, the country had, after independence, really good prospects of becoming one of the richest countries in Africa. We inherited a robust economy, and there was a lot of faith in it in 1980. And to me, anyway, the most revealing thing about bad governance is that before independence, and maybe for about 20 years after independence, Zimbabwe was able to produce enough food, not only to feed um, its own population, but enough to feed to be the breadbasket of the region. In 2000, started the land seizure by Zanu PF, and the farms were given mostly to Zanu PF loyalists. And ever since, the country has struggled to feed itself. We have become a nation dependent on food aid every 2 or 3 years. Somebody once described Zimbabwe uh, agricultural potential as so good that you could plant a broomstick and get fruit from it. That's how good it is. So the fact that now we have become the basket case of a failed nation that has been struggling to feed itself, to me, is testimonial of failed leadership. And the situation has got so worse now that unemployment among our people is soared to 50%, sorry, to 80% plus in the last 20 years. It has never come down. And abject poverty, up to 50% of our people are living in abject poverty. Basic services such as health and education have all but completely collapsed. That is the backdrop of uh, the situation, the political and economic situation in Zimbabwe. There is no denying that we have had serious failed leadership. Who to blame? Well, I think we cannot deny that Zanu PF is to blame. For the best part of the 42 years independence, Zanu PF has been in power, and therefore then they cannot deny that they are responsible for the economic and political mess we are in. We can also blame the opposition, for they've played their role in this economic failure. And then we can also blame the ordinary people, the Zimbabwean people. Ultimately, it is our responsibility as citizens of a country to make sure that the country is properly governed. I'd like to go back to Zanu PF and point out why they have failed. I think the truth of Zanu PF's failure, um, it was almost doomed to happen. When Zanu PF got into power in 1980, they wanted power. They didn't care about the ordinary person. They didn't care about the suffering of the ordinary person. And that is a recipe for bad governance. It is said that when India was fighting for its independence, Mahatma Gandhi and the other Indian nationalists were absorbed by the question, should they take up arms to end, to fight the British, to end British rule? It is said that Mahatma Gandhi and the other leaders agreed that that wasn't a wise thing. An armed struggle, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of leaders will an armed struggle throw? They asked. And their answer was, an armed struggle will throw the kind of leaders who would probably be less tolerant, less democratic. And they said, well, is that the sort of leaders who would want to lead independent India? And I think if you look at Zimbabwe's history, we had an armed struggle. And the sort of leaders that the armed struggle threw up have been undemocratic, ruthlessly oppressive. What they wanted is actually to become the new oppressors. And that's what they've become. Our economic and political situation is, yes, they failed to come up with correct economic policies, and some of them were short-sighted, etc., etc. But if the country had a free, fair, and credible elections, people would have been able to remove them from office, which is what should happen. Then the ordinary person should have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. But the kind of leaders that Zimbabwe's armed struggle threw up, was such that these were individuals who felt they have the right, the divine right, to rule the country. And the issue of free, fair, and credible election was completely out. And that has been the root cause of our problem in Zimbabwe. Can Zanu PF reform itself? I think the answer to that one, most people would agree, because Zanu PF will never reform itself out of power. They have now become so deeply entrenched in power, they can't reform themselves out of power. And hence comes the opposition, the role of the opposition. I think the nation did realize by the late 1990s that without having democratic reforms so that they could have a meaningful say on who rules the country, Zimbabwe would never change. And so the call came for the need for democratic change. And Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends formed the movement for democratic change in answer to that call. And they even named their party the Movement for Democratic Change. So the primary purpose of the MDC was to implement democratic changes. And the MDC was launched in 1999, and now, 22 years later, there is not even one single democratic change that they've implemented. So, yes, the opposition has got to be blamed for the country's economic mess because they failed to implement the reforms. The opposition had the golden chance to implement the democratic reforms during the 2008 to 2018 GNU. 5 years. South Africa and the rest of the other SADC countries had forced Robert Mugabe to sign the 2008 Global Political Agreement, in which he agreed with the need to implement democratic changes. And the task to implement those reforms were passed on to MDC, Mugen Trankira and his friends, to implement. And anyone at all who has followed the performance of MDC throughout the GNU will tell you the MDC slept on the job. There's no denying that Robert Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of high office so that they forgot about the reforms. It is disappointing that some of the electorate have become what I call binary minded, where they can only deal with two things. In this case, they pigeonholed Zanu PF as bad and the opposition as good. And once they've done that, they found it very difficult to judge MDC's performance on the evidence before them. This is typical. During the Liberation War itself, the people had pigeonholed the whites as the bad guys and ZANU PF as the good guys. And in fact, that explains why it took nearly 20 years for the people to finally accept ZANU PF was corrupt and incompetent, because they had placed ZANU PF as the nation's liberators who cannot do and who do nothing wrong. Even in the face of the Kokura Hundi massacres, people you still find they still supported ZANU PF, as if to say, well, okay, maybe there's something going wrong here, but maybe it's not their fault. And the same approach has come with MDC. MDC has failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change even when they had the golden opportunity to do so. But many people find it very difficult to criticize MDC. Some of them is, of course, they failed to understand what the reforms were anyway, while they joined everybody else in calling for democratic changes. Most of them have failed to understand what those democratic changes were, and much less how they were to be implemented. And therefore, then, when MDC failed to implement even one meaningful democratic change, it was water off a duck's back. They didn't understand it. There's still some of them don't understand it even today. And this is the reason why the people themselves have got to carry the responsibility for the mess we are in. Let's go back to the solutions. Well, ZANU PF, like I said before, is not going to reform itself. So it is naive to think that the ZANU PF will ever implement meaningful reforms so that there could be free, fair, and credible elections. A prerequisite for us to have a competent government. So, what is the solution? But if Zanu PF cannot implement the democratic reforms we need to end the dictatorship, we need somebody else to do it. And this is where MDC came in. But if they fail to implement even one democratic reform in 22 years, I think it's clear they're not going to implement any reforms. And this is where the people come in. The people need to accept that MDC have failed. They send MDC as their messenger to implement the democratic reforms. And MDC have failed to implement even one reform in 22 years. And they're not going to implement the reforms. In fact, what is happening now since the GNU of 2008 to 2018, what Nelson Chamisa and this fellow, initially MDC and now Triple C leaders have done is realize if they participate in the election, Zanu PF will give away a few seats, which, of course, Zanu PF needs the opposition to participate for legitimacy, and is willing to give away a few seats, a few gravy train seats, to entice the opposition to participate. And Nelson Chamisa and company have been participating in flawed elections since 2018 for the sole purpose of winning those few gravy train seats that Zanu PF is giving away. The people have failed to realize that, and they need to realize that, because that is the only way they are going to turn around and say, no, MDC, we've lost confidence in you. Some people have argued, well, if Triple C were to not to participate in the elections, the other small parties will participate, and then Zanu PF will still have legitimacy. That is a flawed argument. We've got to understand what happened during the GNU, and in 2018, SADC, who were the guarantor of the global political agreement, advised MDC not to participate. And if MDC had not participated, Zanu PF would have never got legitimacy. This situation can be compared to what happened to Ian Smith when he tried to have his internal settlement. Muzorewa and Tabaningstole participated, but Zanu PF and ZAPU did not participate. And everybody could see the internal settlement was, a sellout situation. And that is why Smith never got legitimacy. It is therefore clear that if the main opposition was to stop participating in this election, of course, Zanu PF will lose legitimacy. And so it is ridiculous that the opposition is keeping on participating. And in this particular case, the excuse that if they don't, then the other small parties will participate and give Zanu PF legitimacy is just nonsense. The alternative argument that they will participate in the flawed elections because they've got strategies of winning rigged elections is also another lie, just to cover up for their excuse for participating. And I think the ordinary people need to smarten up. Unfortunately, life is tough. Those who fail to learn from the past are destined to repeat the same mistake over and over again, and with each pass, pay the price heavily. And so, in our case, that is exactly what has happened in Zimbabwe. 42 years of corrupt and tyrannical Zanu PF have reduced the nation into one of the poorest countries in the world. And the prospects, the economic prospects and political prospects are now so dire that Zimbabwe is honestly on the verge of total economic, social, and political collapse. What has happened in other countries like Somalia, Libya, we should not rule it out as I know they will never happen here. Why not? We should act now to end this madness. At the present moment, I believe the solution to Zimbabwe's present economic situation is staring us in the face. We just need to open our eyes and to see it. Yes, we cannot stop Zanu PF going ahead with the 2023 elections, which they are clearly going to rig. Yes, we cannot stop Nelson Chamisa and company participating. They have got their eyes on the few gravy train seats that Zanu PF is giving away. What we can do, however, is expose this whole electoral election process as a farce. Denounce it. Refuse to participate in it. And make sure that everybody, particularly SADC, see this for what it is, a farce. SADC itself, it's particularly South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia, it is in their own interest that Zimbabwe is not dragged into yet another meaningless election next year. Because if Zanu PF rigs and Zanu PF gets legitimacy, there will be a new wave of Zimbabweans going across the Limpopo to South Africa or Zambezi to Zambia. And of course, some will also go to Botswana. And we've already seen how much these numbers, huge numbers of economic and political refugees have destabilized those countries. SADC have got to seriously think about that. It is in their own interests, particularly those three countries. To be honest, we are not asking them for any favors. All we are saying is SADC will have election observers to these elections in 2023. All we want them is to judge them on the basis of what they say. Those elections should be judged null and void. How can you have an election in which you don't even have a verified voters roll? How can you have a free, fair, and credible election when the electorate are being frog marched to attend rallies and then frog marched to vote for Zanu PF? SADC itself know that the elections are rigged in Zimbabwe. They themselves are the ones who were telling Morgan Tsvangirai in 2013, do not go into these elections. You will lose. The election is done. Because they know that Zanu PF rigs these elections. They endorsed, they turned around and endorsed the 2013 and the subsequent elections as substantially free, fair, and credible. For the simple reason that when they advised Morgan Tsvangirai not to participate and they were ignored, they felt that they had no choice but to throw in the towel. But this has not solved their problem or Zimbabwe's problem. And that is the truth. Zimbabwe's economic and political instability has come not only to haunt Zimbabweans ourselves, but is also haunting some of our friends in the region. And they can stop the madness of rigged elections by turning around and saying, no, these elections were not free, fair, and credible. Particularly countries like South Africa that have managed to hold free, fair, and credible elections since 1994. Botswana, the same thing. Zambia, elections, particularly these last elections, were free, fair, and credible. And all we are asking those three countries is to be honest. It is not for SADC to decide what will happen then if they declared the election null and void. Zimbabweans ourselves will decide. If they declare the elections null and void, Zimbabwe will be put in the same situation as it was in 2008, and hence the need for another GNU. A new GNU will implement the democratic reforms to ensure that elections are free, fair, and credible. That is the course of action that we need in Zimbabwe. And SADC can help deliver that. Another rigged election and endorsing this regime as legitimate will only perpetuate the Zanu PF dictatorship, will only perpetuate the suffering in Zimbabwe, and will drive the nation closer and closer to the precipice. We are very close to it already. And I think it is not for SADC to be the ones who pushed us over the edge by making the wrong decision. SADC countries are some of the countries that are putting the Commonwealth countries under enormous pressure to readmit Zimbabwe into the Commonwealth. That would be one of the worst mistakes that could happen on the eve of the elections in Zimbabwe, because it will only give Zanu PF the confidence that they can rig the elections, get away with it. Because it is not likely that if the Commonwealth was to readmit Zimbabwe without any commitment to making sure that elections are free, fair, and credible, a few months later, Zimbabwe holds elections, and those elections turn out to be flawed. The Commonwealth is not likely to turn around and say, well, those elections were flawed, and therefore then Zimbabwe will be booted out of the Commonwealth again. They're not going to do that. If they've just readmitted them, knowing that Zanu PF has not implemented even one meaningful democratic change to make sure that the elections are free, fair, and credible. I think the Commonwealth is basically saying Zanu PF can go ahead and rig the elections. That will be a disaster for Zimbabwe. And that decision will come to haunt even the Commonwealth itself, because other members in the Commonwealth will see that as a license also for them to extend their stay in power by rigging elections. I started by saying that Zanu PF is a product of an armed struggle, and the armed struggle launched people with a mentality that they have got the divine right to rule. And this is exactly what Zanu PF is doing. All these shenanigans, refusal to hold free, fair, and credible elections, refusal to implement even one meaningful reform, is because Zanu PF believes that they have the divine right to rule the country. And if the Commonwealth, in their collective wisdom, should decide to Zanu PF should be allowed to do so. Then other nations, I think, will do the same. Other nations who are in the Commonwealth will do the same. And I don't think it will be any value to any member or existing members of the Commonwealth right now if it's going to be free for all. So it will be a really serious mistake for SADC to urge the Commonwealth to readmit Zimbabwe, and for the Commonwealth nations as a whole to make the collective decision to readmit Zimbabwe on the eve of the 2023 elections, when the regime has not implemented even one meaningful democratic change to ensure the elections are free, fair, and credible. Those are my views. And thank you very much for listening. Good night.